Hello. Well, welcome back to our podcast. This is kind of our delayed winter podcast that we had scheduled originally back for, I think, February 5th, but we had a nice blizzardy day that day. So thank you. We're back now and it's March, and today we are joined by Dr. Dwayne Elmore, who is our Extension Wildlife Specialist. And you've been on our show quite a bit, and we appreciate all that you give to us and share with us. And so thanks for rescheduling. I know you've got a busy schedule going on. What are you doing right now? Research or?
Yeah, so right now I've got a lot of research projects going. I'm trying to get a student finished this semester and another student started, so that's kept me busy. And then with the warming temperatures, a lot of extension work is going to start happening quick. A lot of field days, and lots of people are starting to call with questions as they start getting out of the house more.
It's beautiful outside now, and we're not having to deal with the winter weather, so it's kind of odd that we're in a podcast, not out shooting a segment.
Exactly.
But, so what are some of the calls that you're getting in? What are people curious about right now?
A lot of people that are interested in managing their property for various wildlife species are calling with questions about, how to do prescribed fire or how to thin or manage their timber. Some people are calling wanting to know about food plots that they can plant this summer.
Okay.
And then there are some wildlife damage calls coming in. Like this is the time of year where we have lots of calls about skunks because this is the breeding season for skunks, so they're really active. And also lots of people are calling about woodpecker damage to their homes because woodpeckers are starting to make cavities and think about nesting this spring.
All right, so it's the time when everyone's looking to partner up, right? The wildlife is. So
everything's getting busy, and sometimes that causes problems, in homes and on landscapes.
Yeah, and I always love talking with you, Dr. Elmore, because you have a neat take on wildlife, but also the ecology and the plants, and so you have a good background in both of those. Let's talk a little bit about your background and how you kind of got into all of this.
So I grew up in Middle Tennessee, just west of Nashville, in a very rural area, and it's mostly forested, and I spent a lot of time early childhood fishing and later hunting, but we did lots of recreation in the outdoors and grew up in a very rural area where there was a lot of opportunity. And then as I got a little older, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do when I grew up, like most of us, trying to figure that out, in middle school and high school. And our local conservation officer that worked for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, he and my father were good friends, and they spent a lot of time looking for very uncommon native plants. And so it was actually plants that kind of steered me towards wildlife. Yeah. So I started, visiting with him about his career, and I was very interested in plants and learning about why certain plants grew where they did and didn't grow where they didn't. And that really kind of cued me up for ecology and to understand why species occur in certain places and how they interact. And I really got interested in these more uncommon plants, and it really kind of stimulated a lot of curiosity, which is kind of the backbone of science. So that started me down the path of wildlife management. And he was the only person I knew that had a degree in wildlife management. And of course, he was in law enforcement, which wasn't my interest, but he told me, well, there's lots of other jobs and opportunities in this field. And so that kind of just snowballed from there.
Is it a growing field? I mean, I know you work with a lot of students and graduate students and stuff. I mean, what are some of the jobs that they're going on to do?
Yeah, it's really varied. I mean, a lot of them do go to work for state wildlife agencies or state natural resource agencies. It could be forestry services or things like that. But there's a lot of federal jobs as well, everywhere from the U.S. Forest Service to Bureau of Land Management. That's a lot of those jobs are out west, but the Forest Service is nationwide. And then NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of USDA. There's a lot of opportunities for natural resource and wildlife. But there's also a lot of private sector jobs, depending on what part of the country you're in. There's lots of private consultants in forestry and wildlife that help answer questions for landowners, both large and small landowners. So there's a wide variety of opportunities. And of course, some of the graduate students we train are interested in science, so some of them are going on for their advanced degrees to try to do research and get in academic institutions.
I would also think industry, like reclamation and, cleaning up around here, like oil well sites and that sort of stuff that you have to go in with native, so many species and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. Timber companies often hire their own wildlife biologists, and mining operations. One of my former technicians from my PhD, he worked for a while for a large mining operation in Utah, so there's opportunities for things like that as well.
And that could take you anywhere in the world, I would imagine, as well. So.
Absolutely.
Very cool, very cool. So, and we've done a lot of, you're mentioning you like finding those unique plants. We've done a lot of segments with you about unique plants. One in particular, the shinnery oak, which is this tree that really doesn't get much higher than waist high, but yet it can be this cluster of trunks, if that's what we properly call it. You can't really tell one from another. You're doing a lot of research on that. Is that still ongoing out in western Oklahoma?
We finished that research project. So the shinnery oak is a clonal oak, which there's lots of clonal woody plants in the world, but we don't often think about oaks being in that group. But there are several that are, like Gamble's oak is another one. It gets taller, but it's also clonal. And these clonal plants, basically what you have is a large root system underground that will have many, many stems. So we typically think of a tree being like a single root system with one stem, but lots of trees aren't like that. Lots of trees have multiple stems, and they can occupy very large areas, and shinnery is one of them. One shinnery plant can maybe be 20 acres in size, and there's not necessarily just one plant on that 20 acres. There might be 100 plants that have overlapping and interlocking roots. So when you see this mass of all these shinnery stems, you're looking at millions of stems and thousands of plants that kind of overlap each other. Some are small, some are large, and it forms this just this mat of vegetation, and it can be really important for a lot of wildlife species that use it for cover and also food, because it produces acorns like all oaks do. And the research we were doing was two parts. One, to try to better understand what wildlife use and require shinnery, and the other part was trying to understand how you could propagate it, because it's not a plant that's commercially available, and it's been removed from a lot of areas that it historically occurred. And so there's interest in, well, how would you restore it? Is it practical to grow these in mass in greenhouses? And then what's the survival if you planted them? So that was a big part of the research, trying to figure out how to germinate it and how to get it to grow.
And I know you were doing some under shade. You were trying to germinate some under shade and had a few planted out there. What did you find is the best way to really germinate them?
So we found that a cold stratification greatly increased germination.
And that's where you put them through a cold treatment for a period of time to kind of create that winter environment.
Simulate a winter. And there's lots of seeds that require that, but not all do. In fact, most oak don't require cold stratification. So that's a little bit actually unique about shinnery. And the closely related Gamble's, it's been found that they require cold stratification too. Or they don't require it, but it increases how many seeds will actually germinate. So that's one big finding. We also found that acorn weevils are a big problem if you're trying to collect these and grow them, because a huge proportion of the acorns are damaged by these weevils, which can lower germination rates. So that's an issue. So that just means you have to collect a lot more acorns than you might think you need.
And is that like you see an obvious hole on the acorn that a weevil's been in there?
No. Okay. You see an obvious hole when the weevil comes out to turn into the adult. But the actual entry point is really small and hard to see, because the larva is so tiny when it first burrows into the acorn. So it's not very obvious, but you can float the acorns in water, and it's not 100% accurate, but it helps you at least pull some out that might be damaged. Another thing we found is the shade that you mentioned. The shade, putting shade cloth over the oaks really reduced growth and survival. So this is a species that needs quite a bit of sunlight to germinate.
Which kind of makes sense, I guess, being out in western Oklahoma into New Mexico. There's not a lot of shade out there, but
Right.
you know, you never know because they're also being dropped around the base of those plants, so they might need that shade to germinate. So it's neat that y'all kind of figured that out.
Yeah, probably a lot of them that fall where there's already shinnery never make
Germinate,
it.
okay.
There's too much competition, but if there's gaps in the canopy,
Okay.
then there's opportunity for the acorn to grow.
Okay, and I think we'll probably put that segment in our comments on Facebook because there's some really neat drone footage that we have from that segment that really kind of shows how some. I mean, you can kind of see how some of them might be different as far as plants, the colors, and I mean, I'm not saying this is scientific evidence or what, but you can kind of see the difference in some of the plants, and just how the landmass that they cover.
Yeah.
It's quite impressive.
And another clonal plant that a lot of people probably are familiar with is aspen.
Okay.
And that's in the fall or in the spring. In the spring, when the plants are first greening up, or in the fall when they're turning color, that's when you can really see where the individual plants are, because they'll green up at different times, or they'll change colors at different times. So you'll see this mountainside full of aspen, and then all of a sudden you'll notice there's patches that have greened out, and there's others that look like they're dormant. Those are
Interesting.
unique plants, and aspen can occupy hundreds of acres.
I didn't
one individual
realize they
plant.
were a colonal plant. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very good. Too bad we can't grow aspen here. They're a beautiful tree, aren't they?
Too hot.
So what are you finding out? Was it quail, if I remember correctly, that had a relationship with the shinnery oak, or?
Yeah, quail use it for cover in particular. Quail are, and bobwhite, northern bobwhite's the quail we're talking about. They're what we call a shrub obligate, which means they have to have low woody cover, shrub cover, and shinnery is one that is really important to them in western Oklahoma.
Okay. So any other things that appreciate that shinnery cover? Or?
Yeah, there's a couple of really small birds that people may not be familiar with. One's called a Cassin's sparrow.
Okay.
Cassin's is named after the person that first named it.
Okay.
It was a last name. And this is a bird that is kind of a southwestern sparrow that occurs in the southwestern part of the U.S. And so western Oklahoma's on the edge of its distribution, but it really uses these shinnery oak communities. And that's a bird that we don't really know much about.
Okay.
There's been very little research, and we know their numbers fluctuate dramatically from year to year, but we don't know
What's causing
exactly
that.
why.
Interesting. And that's what's interesting also about your work is you might be doing research on animals or plants or the relationship between them. So you've got a wide array of knowledge in your head that we like to tap into. So
Well, what we tell our wildlife students, because some of them come in maybe not super excited about plants. They're excited about wildlife, but maybe not plants, and try to tell them, like, you need to get excited about plants, because if you're going to manage wildlife,
you manage the plants.
you're managing the plant communities. And some plants, some animal and plants have very close relationship with each other. Like they depend on each other for like seed dispersal for certain plants, or some insects in particular might require a certain species of plant for its larval growth. So in some cases they're absolutely tied together, but in other, like shinnery and quail, they need them, but they use other plants that are similar. So there are surrogates that species might use. But regardless, it's critical to understand plant ecology and plant taxonomy if you're going to be able to manage for wildlife.
That makes sense. And that's why you even get into managing that plant through prescribed burning and stuff. Before we go into that, I want to ask about, I know there's been a wildfire up in Beaver County, and we've also shot some segments up there in a reserve area. Was that damaged by this wildfire? I know they evacuated some towns and stuff.
So, yeah, there was just a couple days ago a 30,000 acre wildfire, and unfortunately, it burned some structures and homes, and that's really tragic for that community. It did burn a part of the wildlife management area, and we get the question a lot: is that destructive? And anytime you have a major change in vegetation like that, it's going to be good and bad depending on what the species of wildlife. I mean, there are species that need that frequent disturbance and bare ground and lower woody plant cover. So in the short term, it'll benefit those species. And species that require more cover in the short,
shakes everything up.
it just shakes everything up. But those plant communities are very resilient. They've been experiencing fire for thousands of years. This is nothing new, and they come back rapidly, especially if we get a lot of precipitation like we are right now. So in the long term, things are fairly stable out there, but in the short term, you have these dynamic events that kind of shake things up. But that's actually what you need if you want biodiversity, because all these different plants and animals have different niches on the landscape. They don't have the same requirements. So if you want lots of species, the whole world can't look the same.
Right.
So having prescribed fire or timber harvest or hurricanes, these things that seem very catastrophic, that's kind of the root of biodiversity. That's what gives us lots of species.
It changes that system again, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, we were talking about birds a minute ago. I want to go back to another bird question. I've heard a lot about the lesser prairie chicken. I feel like I heard more about it 8 years ago than what I'm hearing about it now. Can you give us an update on what's going on with that? I know there was some controversy about either fences that we have or windmills. How's the chicken doing?
So the chicken numbers have come up a little in recent years, and that's primarily driven by changes in our rainfall. And so we went through a really hot dry period in 2011, 2013, right in there. And the numbers, lots of wildlife, not just chickens, but chickens in particular, because they were already low and we were already worried about them. They'd been on this very long-term decline. So their numbers got catastrophically low. Now they've since bounced back a little because it's been wet. We've had lots of rain the past few years, so that's helped them. And there's also been a lot of habitat work going on to try to address the long-term reason that chickens have declined, which is loss of habitat. So there's lots of things that have harmed chickens' ability to reproduce and to occupy the landscape. But probably, if you could point to one thing that's been the most dramatic, it's tree encroachment. So prairie chickens occur in prairies. They're not a forest bird. So largely because of fire suppression, but also tree planting. I mean, people want trees around their homes for shade, right? I mean, of course they would. But a lot of those trees don't stay put. The birds and wind disperse the seeds, and then when you don't have a lot of fire on the landscape, those trees grow, and the chickens avoid those. So they tend to avoid taller structures, power lines, trees, etc. And so that's caused a lot of habitat loss. So a lot of the conservation focus right now is trying to remove those trees to keep as much prairie as prairie.
And so that goes into the eastern red cedars that are spreading and that sort of stuff, and the lack of fire that might prevent those from spreading. So.
Yeah, eastern red cedar is probably the one tree that's taken the most habitat. But there's others like Siberian elm. Were planted as windbreaks. And so a lot of those.
It's one of the trees that handles that western climate.
Absolutely, it's very well adapted to western Oklahoma. It's a great plant to have in your yard. And as long as the prairie's being burned, it's not a problem. But as soon as you stop burning, those trees are able to get tall, and that's where the chickens have problems.
And that's the thing is I think it was at Pack Saddle we were at, which in western Oklahoma, and we were down in the river bottom and just driving maybe a mile, wasn't even that far south of that river. We were looking at how diverse that ecosystem can change. And one area you have trees, and then one area you're flat again, and the soil changes and everything. So it's really interesting to see the diversity of that and how that affects the ecology and the animals that might be there too. So
yeah, that's one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is you kind of have to be a detective to figure out why things are the way they are on a property. Like when you're asked to come out and evaluate a property and to make recommendations for species or different objectives, you have to think about how the past management on that site has influenced what you're seeing. So fire or lack of fire, but also the soils, as you mentioned. The soils is a huge driver, whether it's a really loose soil like sandy soil or really tight soil like more clay will completely change the plant community and the capacity of that land to produce certain plant and animals.
Right, right. That's as you said, you got to get excited about plant ecology if you want to be a wildlife specialist. I've learned that you got to get excited about soils if you want to be a good gardener and horticulturist. So it all goes back to those soils, even if you're in the animal world.
Yeah,
so
that's the foundation.
Yeah, definitely. And let's get a little bit into, for the home gardener, I mean, I know we could talk about wildlife and ecology all day long, but for people that might be listening who are in the home situation, we have some ecology that might visit our backyards that we don't always want.
Right. Yeah.
So what is it that is enticing that ecology or that wildlife to come in? You said skunks is a popular one right now.
Yeah.
I know armadillos and possums. All of those can be regular visitors in a backyard situation. Squirrels even.
Right. So, I mean, there's several things that we do in the home landscape that makes it really attractive to wildlife. It could be everything from putting bird feeders out, which attracts squirrels. You want the birds, but most people don't want the squirrels, so that can be a nuisance at times. Trees, we usually have trees for shade and aesthetic reasons around the home, and there's lots of species that use those trees for nesting and cover, which can be good and bad depending on the species and how many there are and when they're there. And then, even our home provides structure. Lots of animals like to get under your home,
Right.
because it's basically like a burrow. It's like going underground for shelter. And so those are some things from a cover and food standpoint we see, but also our turf. I get a lot of calls in the summer from people having armadillo issues. And armadillos like to have the insects and the grubs they're eating close to the surface. So if you're irrigating your lawn and keeping it mowed, it's easy for them to find food. So a lot of the cultural practices that we have on our lawn can influence the wildlife damage issues that you're going to face.
And a lot of times people think armadillos are the problem because they're digging up all the grubs and tearing up your yard, but really it's a grub problem that you might need to deal with, right? It's the food source for those armadillos.
Right. I mean, that's why they're there. And, the thing about a lot of these wildlife damage issues, most of them that I get calls about are nuisance. There are some that are genuine human health concerns. Like if you have bats in your attic, we love bats. They're very important.
We put bat houses out in our yard.
But we don't want them in our attic.
Yeah.
That's not where you want them because there are some zoonotic diseases that could be an issue. So while you may want bats in your landscape, you don't want them in your house.
Right.
So sometimes there are health issues, but most of the time it's simply a nuisance, like an armadillo digging your turf up, or a skunk that sprayed your dog. They're just
tomato
annoying.
Juice doesn't work like they say
it does. No, time is the only thing that helps. But those are nuisance issues, and so everybody has a different tolerance for nuisance.
Right.
So I think I always tell people when they call about a question, the first thing you need to decide is what your tolerance is.
So it's an education process for the homeowner too.
Absolutely, because sometimes the cost, and I don't mean just monetary, but the time, the hassle, the stress of trying to deal with the wildlife damage problem may be more than the nuisance they're causing. So you really have to think about this as kind of cost benefit.
Right. And I would also imagine, like I live out in the prairie, I'm out in the open. We, have a lot of different things that come around, and I have armadillos in my yard. But I also know, like, if I was to do something, I feel like another armadillo would just come back in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's always a supply because we're out in the open so much. So maybe being aware of is it a one-time occurrence because you're in a neighborhood and this random animal might have found your backyard, or are you fighting an uphill battle?
Right. There's always going to be replacements. So,
Right.
If you do something about that one armadillo, it might buy you a little time. And also I think you have to think about what turf you have. Like if I'm dealing with a Bermuda grass lawn, I'm going to be a lot more tolerant of armadillos than I would be in a fescue lawn.
True.
Because in Bermuda, they're going,
it'll recover.
It so quickly recovers. I mean, it might look a little unsightly until you mow, but it's probably not going to do much damage to the turf. But in fescue, where you're having to seed every year
Right.
in Oklahoma, it can cause some more damage issues. So my tolerance level can change depending on the plant that's being impacted.
Right. Very good. And so what are some of the main things? I know with armadillos, really, if somebody does have an armadillo, can you talk us through that process of trapping an armadillo? You make that V, right? You funnel them into a cage sort of a thing?
So you want a live catch trap first, and a pretty big one. It needs to have like a 10, 12-inch wide and tall opening. And you can get one with an opening on both ends if you like. That increases your chance of catching the armadillo, but you don't have to have that. One opening will work. But the first thing is to find the part of the landscape where you're having the most damage and try to target that area, because there's probably a reason the armadillo is going there. Maybe you're irrigating that area more, or maybe like in my yard, we have an area that's mulched pretty heavy, and it stays real moist because of all the mulch, and so the insects are close to the surface, and the armadillo really hits that area. So I know that that's going to be a prime area. So I'm usually going to set my trap there, and then I try to anticipate how the armadillo is going to enter the landscape. Where is it likely coming from?
And are they like mice? They kind of follow walls a little bit?
They do.
Okay.
And they have burrows, so they can be fairly predictable. They're often coming in the same way and leaving the same way every night. And so you can anticipate that. And we use these long funnels, and chicken wire works great with just pieces of rebar to hold it up. Anything that will kind of funnel them towards the trap. And so we're not necessarily using bait for armadillos. In fact, we rarely do.
Because aren't they blind? Aren't they kind of just clumsy and just...
They have poor vision.
Okay, yeah.
But excellent smell.
Okay.
And you can use the smell to your advantage. One thing I found that seems to help, it's not a guarantee, but if you're trapping armadillo, you might notice sometimes that these damage issues come in pulses. Like you'll have 2 or 3 nights of damage, and then it'll back off. And a lot of that has to do with irrigation. So if you're irrigating your lawn and everything else around you is dry, they seem to be attracted to that. So you can use that to your advantage. If you know
Do they smell the water?
It's not known what's going on, but that's my guess, is they can actually...
Like we can smell rain sometimes?
Yeah. I don't know for sure, but I know that if you'll water the spot where you want to catch them and not the rest of your lawn, usually the catch rate goes up.
So use your irrigation to your benefit
Absolutely.
as well.
You can help concentrate them. So really water that area. And then the other thing I like to do when I set my trap is I'll dig up some fresh soil from somewhere, and I'll line the bottom of the trap with that soil. That does 2 things. One, they don't feel the metal when they walk in. It feels like they're walking on soil, which armadillos aren't super trap shy, but that could help if the armadillo is been missed before. But the other thing it does, they can definitely smell that fresh soil, and they do seem to be attracted to areas where there has been recent digging. So those are 2 things that I do that are really small and simple that do seem to help catch armadillos a little more effectively.
So do they not smell the human on the chicken wire or any of the trap that you've made or anything?
Not that we know of. Yeah, there's no indication of that.
And I've also heard that they're born in multiples of 4 and that they're all the same sex. Is that true? Do you know?
They're quadruplets. Yeah, so it's armadillos always start with a single fertilized egg that then splits four ways.
So they're genetically identical as 4.
Yeah, identical quadruplets.
Wow.
So that's unique. And the other thing that's unique about them is they are the only other mammal in the world that we know of, besides humans, that can catch and transmit leprosy.
That's I've heard that too.
Yeah.
You don't want to touch them, right?
No, and the chance of contracting that's very, very low.
Yeah.
But I would never handle an armadillo or an armadillo trap that one has been in without gloves. And then the other thing you might want to think about for the home gardener, you're probably going out in your landscape and repairing armadillo damage sometimes. You should wear gloves doing that. So not just because of the potential for leprosy, which is probably pretty low, but there's other zoonotic diseases and just bacteria in the soil.
Yeah, anything with wildlife. It's always good to be,
Just wear gloves when you're fixing those little divots that they've created.
Right. Okay. And then do they jump too? Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
When they're scared?
Yeah, in fact,
They jump right up underneath cars when
they do. And when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine I went to graduate school in Mississippi State, which Mississippi has lots of armadillos. And one of my friends in graduate school, he was from the north, and he'd never seen an armadillo, so he was really fascinated. First one he
They're
saw.
very unique looking animals.
They are little tanks. And, he's looking at it, and he kind of leans over it. And I should have been nicer and warned him about this, but I didn't. And as he's leaning over it, the armadillo gets spooked, and it jumps up and hits him in the nose. And, of course,
How high do they jump?
About, three
What's
or
their
4
vertical
foot.
jump, man?
4 feet.
Excellent.
Yeah. So it's a defense
Yeah.
that they have. But if you happen to have your head over them when they do that, it's not good. Yeah.
It's scary. I bet
Yeah.
it. And then possums, I've heard, are good for ticks. Is that true? Or
So,
that they eat a lot of ticks in your landscape?
well, they eat a lot of ticks that get on them.
Right. And so they're like mops, I've heard.
Yeah, so they, like any mammal, they're attracting, and birds too, they're attracting ticks. They're warm-blooded. So, but unlike a lot of other mammals, they are very efficient at removing those ticks. And so if you catch a possum, you'll find hardly any ticks on it. And it's not because the ticks aren't getting on the possum, it's because the possum removes them.
And they're really clean.
So they're killing a lot of ticks, and they're not allowing those ticks to fall off and form more ticks.
Right.
So they actually, they're not a reservoir for increased tick burdens in your landscape.
Okay. Like deer might be, right?
Yeah.
Deer are a big
or
problem.
rodents.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they're just, I don't know. I'm not a fan of possums. I keep telling myself that they're collecting ticks and eating
Yeah.
them, but they're kind of scary looking,
They're-
especially if they ever hiss at you.
They're an interesting animal.
And then are they marsupials? Is that right? So
Yeah,
they
they
carry their babies all on them, and yeah,
Yeah.
not a fun critter to look at, in my opinion. But they can have all the ticks. So let's get into a little bit about plants. There
Okay.
is our lovely Callery pear that's blooming right now.
Yeah.
Aren't we all excited about that plant? And so let me ask, because first I know we've got a lot of other white flowering trees that are good trees that are native. I don't know that I've seen them blooming just yet. So do Callery pears tend to bloom earlier
They do.
than some of the Mexican plums and stuff? So likely what you're seeing right now is a Callery pear blooming.
Yeah, usually the first week or two of March, the Callery pears start to bloom.
Okay.
And typically the plum, sand plum, Mexican plum, American plum, Oklahoma plum, they all start a little later.
With
So-
red buds, right? I mean, I haven't even seen red buds.
No,
come out
yeah.
yet.
So it's usually later in March, but there is some overlap. You'll have some Callery pear and some plums bloom at the same time.
Right.
But from a growth form standpoint, they don't look anything alike. The leaves are very different. Structure of the plant's very different. So they're fairly easy to distinguish if you look closely. But you can't just assume that a white blooming tree is
It's a bad
Callery.
one. Yeah, yeah.
But it probably is because we have so many.
And even we've done a segment about this, in forested areas that, are next door to neighborhoods or whatever, you're like, there's no way that many Callery pears could have been planted, but they're reseeding and they propagate easily and
Yeah.
they colonize too, kind of, and sprout. And
Yeah, they produce a fruit that birds eat, and then they defecate the fruit, and it germinates. And it's a problem in forest and prairies. In prairies, it's converting the prairie to a forest. And in forest, it's converting the understory and midstory to a Callery pear-dominated site, which historically there would have been things like redbud or dogwood, depending on what part of the state you're in.
Right.
Native plants. So, yeah, it's a real problem. It costs landowners money to manage this plant. It can displace wildlife, especially prairie wildlife. And this one is, I think a lot of people don't recognize how difficult it is to manage it because eastern red cedar gets a lot of attention, and it should because it's really increased dramatically. But eastern red cedar is easy to kill. You can
Well,
cut it down and it doesn't resprout.
right. And what I like, what you've always said, is eastern red cedar is native.
It is native.
So it's a land management problem, not an invasive problem,
That's
right?
exactly
Whereas
right.
the Callery pear is not a native plant.
Yeah, and we have lots of non-native plants that we use.
We do, yeah,
That
yeah.
are that.
I'll
stay
probably
pl-
be talking about some on
Yeah.
the show next
Yeah,
week.
I mean, lots of plants that we use in the home garden aren't native,
Right.
but they stay put.
Right.
And they don't cost, millions of dollars of damage across
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. like Callery pear does. And I think for a long time people assumed that Callery pear, we were too far west, that
Mm.
it's not going to be an issue here. Like if you go to Tennessee or Kentucky, I mean, it's just, it's really a major pest plant.
Yeah.
But we're getting there in Oklahoma. I mean, especially I-35 East. It's really becoming a major issue, and it, like you said, it is invasive, and it's beautiful in the spring, but there's good alternatives. I mean, people can have good alternatives in their landscape that aren't going to cause a problem for their neighbors.
Yeah, and I think you have a leaflet on that. Is that correct?
We do.
On why the Callery pear is such a problem. We say Callery pear. A lot of people know it as the Bradford pear, but that is a particular cultivar.
Correct.
And I think originally these were touted as being, sterile. Some of them were, but there's the Cleveland pear. There's a lot of different types of pear trees, but they've all pretty much become invasive.
Yeah. They were bred to be sterile, but with other types of pears on the landscape, that didn't last very long.
Yeah. So, what are some? Let's go ahead and talk about some of the alternatives. We mentioned Mexican plum. If you're looking for that white flower.
Yes,
What?
that blooms early. And if you just want an early blooming plant that stays kind of, 20, 30 feet tall, redbud is a great one. It obviously doesn't have, well, there are white redbuds now, but, it's native redbuds are pink to purple. But that's a really good alternative. Carolina buckthorn is another one, especially if you're in the eastern part of the state. That would be a good alternative. That's kind of a mid-story tree that's also native. So those are all commercially available.
Okay.
So you should be able to find those, especially the redbud is the easiest to find, but even the plums are.
And again, while the birds might eat the little seeds on the Callery pear, what you're doing by introducing natives rather than the Callery pear, you're going to affect the wildlife too, right? So you're going to get different wildlife. You're still going to get those birds that are coming to your Callery pears, but
Yeah, all the ones I mentioned, all those native alternatives are really good wildlife plants too. They produce seeds that lots of animals eat. They are important for pollinating insects that will come, to the blooms in the spring, and they provide the cover
Right.
for birds. Another problem with Callery pears that I think gets lost on some homeowners, but if you're in a shopping center, if you're managing a shopping center, this is not lost on you. They are very attractive to starlings and grackles. So a lot of these problems that we hear about in shopping centers where their cars getting defecated on and, the birds are a major nuisance, usually I can predict that they've probably got Callery Bradford pears in that area because it has a real dense architecture.
Right.
And it's very attractive to grackles and starlings and blackbirds. So the mass plantings of these trees are really become a wildlife damage issue.
Right, I think they kind of look like lollipop trees. Like they just go straight up in this little circle or oval
Real
or a
dense.
canopy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's also why they're so prone to wind damage too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Wind.
they have really weak angles where they join to the trunk, and so they easily snap off. And so
Yeah.
you often see half a lollipop tree out
And
there.
ice damage too.
Yeah, ice damage
Yeah.
as well. So, and they kind of stink.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
So.
A lot of people don't like
There
the
are
smell.
some cons.
Yeah.
I mean, I know people like the white flower, the perfect shaped tree, but that might not last long.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot less of them being sold in nurseries
Good,
than
yeah.
used to, but you can still find them. But unfortunately, there's so much seed source
Yeah.
out on the landscape now. They're not going to go away without intervention. I mean,
Right.
people are going to have to physically remove them.
Yeah, because you often see undeveloped land next to a neighborhood that's just full of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I interrupted you when you were talking about eastern red cedar, how you can cut it down, right? And it's
Yeah.
dead
Right.
on Callery Pears.
They resprout.
Yeah.
So, if it's a very young tree, if it's germinated in the past year or two, you might be able to cut it and kill it. But if it's been there for any length of time and it has a root system established, it's just going to keep resprouting. So you're going to have to use herbicide to remove it.
Paint that. And then you've got how many stumps to go
Yeah.
in there and remove and
Right.
stuff. So real problem. And it's something that we like to communicate to consumers, but I know on the other end, we're also talking to industry and nurseries, trying to get them to quit selling it and that sort of stuff as well. So
Yeah, we want unique plants in our landscape. People like to try new things, and most of the time that works out okay, but sometimes we have these ecological disasters that we unleash. So I just caution people before they buy a new plant, do a little research and find out if this one is likely to be a problem.
yeah.
Nandina is another one.
I was going to say, let's talk about some of our other problems.
Yeah.
We're all guilty of this. We promote a plant one year and we find out the next year that it's become a problem. So
Well, yeah, most of these, people didn't know
Right,
when
right.
when they, unleashed it. It's
Yeah.
just now, in retrospect, it's like, yeah, that.
we've got to be cautious about that. So Nandina's,
Yeah, western Oklahoma is probably a little too dry for Nandina, but eastern, especially southeastern Oklahoma, Nandina is a problem. It's escaped into forested areas. English ivy is another one. Creeping euonymus is another one. These are all commercially available and widely used. Japanese honeysuckle.
so is creeping euonymus like being spread by seed? How is that being, and
Yeah.
same with English ivy? I've obviously seen in neighborhoods where it's overgrown and taken over and maybe creeped down into the back neighborhood creek and that sort of stuff. How is it getting to a wild location from?
So the English ivy is several ways vegetatively. Like you said, it's just
Yeah,
spreading.
yeah.
Or sometimes if it's in a floodplain, pieces will get broken
Oh,
in a
okay.
flood and then redistributed downstream, and it'll sometimes take root. But then it does bloom sometimes. We don't see the blooms often, but
it
it
takes
does
a
bloom.
while for it to be a mature age
Yeah.
on the English ivy.
But eventually it'll bloom, and then a bird can move the seed.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And that's part of your Dirty Dozen. I know there's a sheet on that, but you also have a fact sheet about problem plants. So, are there alternatives mentioned in that?
There are,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So, there's always a substitute, right?
Yeah, because it's really not very helpful to tell people there's a problem unless you can provide some kind of solution.
You're such a good extension specialist, right? That's the plan, is to provide people with solutions.
Well, I like to garden too, and if someone tells me, well, that's not a good plant, then I'm automatically going to think, well, I need a vine here for
Right.
some reason. So what can I use?
Right. We tend to think of our application of that plant and then the function of that plant. So yeah, if we know something is off that list, then what else can we use to do
Right.
that? So, what are some animals? You mentioned redbuds. What are some animals that do animals feed on the seeds of redbuds a lot, or?
Yeah, lots of rodents.
Okay.
And I know people are thinking, well, I don't know if I want rodents, but we're talking not just rodents that are problems, but native rodents,
Okay.
like voles and things. But also birds. There are birds that'll eat the seed. So, lots of small birds and lots of small mammals will
Okay.
eat the seed of redbud.
Okay. Because it's a legume, right?
It is a legume.
I never think of it as a legume because
Yeah.
of the leaf. I
Yeah.
tend to think of that bipinnately compound leaf.
Yeah.
But it has a pod, so.
Yeah, not all legumes have that classic leaf structure that
Yeah.
we think of, but they do all have
Pods.
and the bloom.
Oh,
It's
okay.
a very unique, clasping bloom structure.
Okay.
So the redbud individual blooms are pretty small, but if you ever look at them closely in the spring, here in a
Okay.
couple weeks, it looks just like a pea. Or,
The sweet pea kind
Yeah,
of look
absolutely.
to it. Okay, all right, good to know. Well, then let's talk a little bit about a few other things. Any prescribed burning y'all have? I've been driving out on 51.
Yeah.
It seems like there's been some burning happening. Is that you guys out there? Or?
Some of it is, and some of it's contract burns.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, this is an active fire season in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Lots of people are burning at the end of the winter, right before spring.
And talk to us through that process. Why is now the season for prescribed burning?
Well, a lot of it is just tradition. There's there can be certain objectives that are better met by burning this time of year, but in some cases we find when we ask a landowner, well, why are you burning, and it might be for livestock or wildlife reasons, often they would be better off burning at another season of the year, July, August, September, October, whatever. But traditionally, most people burned at the end of the winter, and there's some reasons for that. But a lot of the mass pulse of burning we see now is more tradition necessarily than it is anything else. We do encourage people to use prescribed fire to meet objectives, but I would encourage people to think carefully about what their objectives are and what season of year might best meet those objectives, and they can talk with a resource specialist to help them with that decision. But using prescribed fire in the late winter does meet a lot of landowner objectives, like livestock, if they're trying to increase forage. But if you were trying to control woody plants or to get more pollinator plants, there might be another time of the year that would be better for you.
Yeah, I know we've talked with Dr. Laura Goodman about even just mowing habits, that sometimes we think we need to mow at this certain time, but mowing habits can affect different plant communities from coming up, and so I would imagine burning would do the same also.
Yeah, mowing is something that from a wildlife perspective can be really detrimental. A lot of people want to mow, like especially if you've got like everybody wants the area right around their house to be mowed, and from a safety standpoint that makes sense even. But if you've got like a 5 or 10 acre lawn, just cutting back on your mowing, you're providing a lot of food and shelter for lots of different organisms, not just birds and small mammals, but even insects. And changing when you mow that can have huge implications for things that you might really care about, like monarchs. If you'll not mow it, during that midsummer or early summer period, and then wait till the monarchs have the eggs have hatched and the monarchs have moved on, maybe mow later in the summer. Not only are you providing the habitat for those monarchs, but when they come back through in the fall, they've got an opportunity to lay eggs again. So just changing the timing of mowing could have huge implications. And we see this on our roadsides too. People might be noticing, like on I-35, less mowing happening these days. Not only is that saving taxpayers millions of dollars, but it's providing habitat for lots of insects, including monarchs.
They're waiting until that Asclepia is blooming, basically, and I think it's around after Memorial Day that they try to wait at least July. Maybe
a lot of those sites used to be mowed maybe
like
2 or 3 times a summer. And on the areas where they're not having problems with really invasive plants like Johnson grass.
There is and that can be a safety problem too, because Johnson grass can get tall, and if it's up near the road, you can't see if deer are coming up, whatever. So
there's federal requirements about
the safety zone, absolutely.
But
and we're talking outside of that.
Outside of the safety zone, they've cut back to mowing maybe only once a year, and the timing is specific for monarchs. So that subtle change can have big implications, because we're talking about that adds up to thousands, tens of thousands of acres statewide.
And also you might find other species of plants that come up because they have that opportunity. And we've done some segments with some homeowners that have the 5 to 10 acre lawn, and they just quit mowing it. And they're getting Indian paintbrush, they're getting liatris, and all of these pretty wildflowers that are coming up to really create that prairie look in their garden, and they haven't done anything.
Absolutely.
So we're making ourselves work more.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Why do all of that hassle? So let's talk. We've got just, I think, a few more minutes, about 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Is there any field days that are coming up that you want to share, just in case we might have viewers listening that might be interested in some of those? Do you have any extension work that we should be aware of?
So we're kind of just now starting to set our field days for the year, but if someone's interested, probably for the wildlife and natural resource ones, probably the best place they can go to check to see the schedule is our website, which is wildlifechairs.okstate.edu. and there's a link on there for events.
Okay. What are some give us some examples of some of the field days you've done in the past that people might be?
Yeah. Like last year, we did a couple of field days for management of wild turkey. We did several on managing property for quail, for bobwhite. We've done field days in the past on wildlife damage issues. We've even done some on like birding, like, how to get kids interested in birds and bird watching.
Okay.
So they're pretty variable.
They range. And you usually have those around the state, right? They're not all in Stillwater.
That's correct, yeah.
I feel like most of them are away from Stillwater, in fact.
Yeah, we try to move around and do different parts of the state.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we wish you luck with everything that's going on.
Thank
and
you.
Wrapping up your students and that sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
I know we're all gearing up for spring break. Are you sticking around, or you got plans over spring break?
No, I'll be here.
Okay. Hold your nose to the grindstone,
That's right.
getting everything else done. Well, we appreciate your time, Dr. Elmore, and we thank you for your information, and I hope to have you on the show again sometime. So,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, and I think we have one little segment that maybe we can air about that Callery pear as we exit out here.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
We are here with Dr. Dwayne Elmore, a wildlife specialist for OSU Extension, and we're out in a field behind a neighborhood, and you can see that there's a forest growing here almost.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what we're looking at?
These are Callery pear. A lot of people know them as Bradford pear, which is one of the more popular cultivars of the Callery pear.
Okay, and so people are planting Bradford pears, and what they don't realize is they're reseeding out in the wild.
Yeah, they're highly invasive in Oklahoma, and they're invading a lot of prairies and shrublands, and has huge environmental consequences.
What makes them such an invasive species?
Well, a lot of the traits that we desire in them for a landscape plant, actually, they grow fast. They can grow in a wide variety of sites. So, and they produce abundant seed, which is bird dispersed.
Okay, so how can we, manage that a little bit differently? Is there a different plant that we should use in our home landscape? Or?
Absolutely. We have a OSU fact sheet that talks about control of Bradford pears, but it also gives you alternatives, things like redbud, Mexican plum, American plum. These are all good native alternatives that are not invasive and also don't generally have such a bird problem. The other problem with Bradford pears a lot of homeowners complain about is that Bradford is a major problem, particularly east of I-35, and places like Arkansas are actually one of their most problematic invasive plants now.
So I think this is a great example of how a homeowner who maybe just has a small lot can actually impact the surrounding native plant community.
Absolutely.
So if they're nearby and they plant a Bradford, this might be a result.
That's right.
To find out more information about show topics, as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure and visit our website, oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. And we always have great information, answers to questions, photos, and gardening discussions on your favorite social media as well. Join in on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows, as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater jewel. We would like to thank our generous underwriter, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is also provided by Pond Pro Shop, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticultural Society, and the Tulsa Garden Club.